I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I am Sunil Dasgupta. Last week, I went to the Maryland Association of Counties Summer Conference in Ocean City, Maryland. It was my first time. And I came back with COVID. Also my first time. I'd avoided the virus for 4.5 years. No more. Now that my brain fog is beginning to lift with my last dose of Paxlovid, I'm thinking about what I learned from MakoCon. And I realized that last day of the conference, the Saturday morning, when my brain fog was already setting in without even my knowing it, the events of that Saturday morning, including the closing address by Governor Westmore, provided an incredible insight into the central dilemma that besets the state government. On the one hand, state Democrats who control both chambers of the legislature and the governor's office have articulated ambitious goals for education and transportation. The governor himself recently announced that the resurrected Red Line transit in Baltimore will be light rail, not bus rapid transit. A clearly more expensive option. But on the other hand, state revenues are facing headwinds. Projected deficits loom large, and statewide elections in 2026 means that any tax increase is becoming harder and harder. To get the full picture, I called Bryan Sears, the veteran statehouse reporter now working for Maryland Matters, who also spent last week in Ocean City.
I Hate Politics is brought to you by UMBC's Political Science Program, where you'll learn to shape public policy, impact communities, and function at the center of modern society. Learn more at shadygrove.umbc.edu.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society moving, precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Alexandria, Virginia, art rock band Jackie and the Treehorns. Stephen Rubin and Pam Long on vocals, guitars, and piano. Frank Caputo on the bass and synth. And Bryan Gibson on the drums.
If they only knew what would the world come to.
Bryan Sears, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thank you for having me.
We were both at the Maryland Association of Counties annual summer conference in Ocean City last week. I want to ask you, what was striking to you about the conference this year?
For me, I think it is the continued discussion. Maybe a good word is the continued angst by local government leaders about the state of the budget, both the state of the state's budget and how that will affect the state of local government's budget. All of this rolls downhill, and I think that there are a lot of moving pieces. Primarily the blueprint, but also separately and adjacent the Transportation Trust Fund. And I think there's a lot of concern about how local governments are going to pay for things and whether or not the state, given its situation, will come back as it has done in the past and take money away from local government and force them into more unfunded mandates and paying for things that they aren't currently paying for.
Can you lay out the broader fiscal situation in Maryland?
Two separate but adjacent problems that that the state and local government are going to have to figure out, and that is the operating budget. In Maryland, we are seeing we're going to start seeing significant structural deficits, which is essentially the difference in your budget between the things that you are expecting to pay for, and the difference between the projected revenues. I can tell you for most years in Maryland, we look at increases in mandated spending that run about 5%. And increases in expected revenues usually go 3.5%. And, even for this simple Middle River boy, those numbers don't match up. And so that means you have to figure some things out. Lumped onto that, we have the Blueprint for Education, which is a generational reform in Maryland's K through 12 education program. And it's billions of dollars, and we're starting to implement the most expensive parts at the same time that the Blueprint Trust Fund is starting to run out of money to pay for things, which means that the operating budget is going to start having to absorb these costs. We're looking at an initial hit of about $1 billion that very quickly, I believe in fiscal 27 or 28, gets to $3 billion. There is a local portion of this that local governments are responsible for picking up, and they are struggling to come up with the money on their end. There is also in the coming year, on top of this $1 billion budget deficit that we were already expecting, the state has started to, the governor made some cuts in July to the current year budget because of increases in Medicaid enrollment and use and enrollment in a state child care subsidy, which we're being told push another, we'll add another almost $800 million or so to that number. They've cut $150 million out of the current budget. So clearly there's probably going to be a little more work to do, or we're going to have to find some money in there somewhere. There's a little bit of money sitting in the rainy day fund, but that is not an endless pot of money. And then there's transportation. I mean, we know in December that they announced that the Transportation Trust Fund was struggling to keep up with the things that it's required to do, which is the basic maintenance, what they call state of good repair. On top of all of the other things that local governments and state governments want in terms of highway and transit projects. That hole is about $3 billion over 6 years. And I know from my reporting that local government leaders were already starting to get the news this past week in Mako that anything essentially that isn't shovel in the ground is probably going to get paused.
We were both at that meeting of county leaders, and there seemed like a clear divide between some counties, such as Montgomery, which wanted to raise revenue, and others, maybe Worcester, where they were saying, give us the ability to decide which parts of the blueprint we want to do and which parts we want to ditch. There was particularly some angst about, the role of unions. If there is that divide, which side is winning right now?
The status quo is winning. I mean, right now, the blueprint is what the blueprint is. And local leaders have heard repeatedly that they're going to have to find a way to do this. And I will tell you that meeting that you sat in on Saturday morning, that was a calm meeting. I was in a session in December at the winter conference of Mako with a panel that included Britt Kerwin, and there were a lot of the same people in that room, and it was a much more charged atmosphere. There was a lot of pushback. There were a lot of local governments from small counties like Dorchester, who were talking about how this is hurting them. The Prince George's County administrative officer was on the panel. And she was discussing how this is essentially, overshadowing everything. She had the best line probably of that seminar. She said she's just a simple girl trying to balance a budget, and that the blueprint is making that extremely hard for her. Baltimore City is in a similar situation. They're having a hard time coming up with the funds. So there are some large counties, along with the smaller counties. Montgomery County is in a very different situation. The counties are limited by the state in what they can raise, and so a lot of them are at their limit, whether it is at the state limit or at their political limit. Both are, I think, we could argue both are real limits. And so there's a lot of concern from counties that don't have the money and are looking at this, whether you're Dorchester or Prince George's County, and trying to figure out, like, if we have to pay for this, what goes away. I think what doesn't go away are the policies. So one of the things that I hear a lot of chatter about is the idea of extending the glide path by which the state and the local government implements the blueprint and therefore absorbs the costs. Right. And so I think that, the state is looking at very real concerns about how they're going to pay for this. And so I think that, they're also not looking at raising taxes in the next 2 years of during this term. And so I think that that's one area that you could see a lot of discussion around. I don't know whether you'll see actual movement, but I think that there's going to be some discussion and some debate about expanding that glide path.
There is that central problem that you have to spend this much money based on policy, but you don't want to raise revenue. And there doesn't seem to be a way to break that.
Tale as old as time, isn't it? Government wants what it wants, but also, there are these very real political considerations. And even in Maryland, voters are willing to tolerate, certain levels of taxes. Maryland is a high cost state. The state of the economy and the perception of the state of the economy do not have people in a position, I think, where they're willing to have that discussion.
And into this dilemma walks in Governor Wes Moore. What did you think about his closing address at Mako?
The key takeaways here, if you sort of lop off the beginning and the end, are that there are some tough fiscal decisions. This is the third time he's said that to them in 3 speeches to Mako conventions since being sworn in. The other takeaway is that he is open. He talked about refinements to the blueprint. But I think the interesting thing for that is that in no point during the 33 minutes did he ever discuss what kinds of refinements he might be willing to support.
It seems like he is waiting to find that opening where he would say, okay, this is what we will do. And that opening is not here yet.
Well, and he may also be waiting to see what the legislature comes up with. I have had conversations with some lawmakers, and one of them being House Ways and Means Chair Vanessa Atterbury, and we talked about the budget and we talked about revenues. And one of the things that she said repeatedly is that she was waiting to hear what the governor had to say on this.
On the one hand, the governor is waiting for what the legislature would do. The legislative leaders are waiting for the governor would do. Meanwhile, the problem is not getting any easier. So the window is actually closing if you both politically and I would assume fiscally, right? Because now we are headed now into the election season. They are in a pickle. And so I'm just wondering, is there a negotiated end to this? Or is this going to really be another key bridge? The governor makes a big argument about bringing the state together around the key bridge. And the state did come together. And it was an incredible recovery from what is just unbelievable disaster. But he compares that to the blueprint and the budget, and those are policy decisions. Those are not like an extraneous exogenous shock that came and that brings a rally around the flag effect. The blueprint is an ideological difference if you listen to the county leaders. I was thinking about this a little bit, and I thought it was crab and trout.
Right. Or as my grandmother used to say, apples and meat.
It's a very, very difficult situation. Perhaps the only thing to do is to let an emergency develop and then force everybody's hands. So within the opportunity of a crisis,
You're starting to think like a cynical statehouse reporter. I asked that same question of Guy Gazzone earlier in the year during session, and just point blank said, "Look, is the plan here to let things get as bad as they can get to the point where the Kate you make the and he sort of looked at me and said, "No, that's not what they're doing." I mean, I think he seemed actually surprised that I would verbalize that. But look, I mean, one a being a cynical reporter, and seeing the fact that, for example, the House and the Senate are they are so different. They are on different sides of this issue in terms of revenues. The House is ready to raise revenues, and Senate President Bill Ferguson and leadership there are not ready to do that. They want to live within their means and find places to cut.
One chamber is very different than the other chamber. Do you have an understanding why?
I mean, look, I will tell you, after I've been in Annapolis for more than 2 decades, and I will tell you that the Senate has always been, I'm gonna use a charged word here, but it's always been a little more conservative. They tend to move a little slower on these things. The House has always been a little bit more of a progressive chamber. Willing, and also on the Republican side, the Republican members of the House always tend to be a little more, a little more to the right of the political spectrum, to the point where I have often joked that sometimes when very conservative Republicans in the House who had reputations as being bomb throwers on the floor have moved over to the Senate, they seem to change, and I started referring to that as becoming Senatized. It's a strange phenomena that I think a lot of us. I mean, I know I certainly spend time thinking about, but I don't know that I have a handle on why that is. I think some of it was driven by Mike Miller when Mike Miller was president of the Senate for all those years. I think some of it is relationship driven. There are. In the Senate, there are 47 members. And so it's much easier for the Senate president to have relationships with 46 other members, like interactive personal relationships, than it is even in the House, where you not only have 141 members, but the Speaker also has 90 members of her chamber in her caucus. It's much more difficult.
The governor gave pep talks, and in between there was, there are changes coming. It's going to be tough love, but, you're going to have to deal with it. And then the pep talks. Do you think the pep talks work?
I have yet to meet the politician, the elected official, who was so silver-tongued that he could talk people out of believing what they believe. I still think that these political divides, especially in small counties that are very Republican. I mean, remember, these counties in Maryland that are Republican, they're very Republican. They vote red consistently. I think that those are very real, and that leaders of those jurisdictions, represent the viewpoints of those constituencies. Maryland tends to be a blue, if not sort of purplish state, because of the fact that there are a number of very large jurisdictions like Prince George's County and Montgomery County and Baltimore County that are very Democrat, and that in the past have elected Democratic governors, even when every other jurisdiction in the state voted majority for someone else. So, I think that I think in a lot of these smaller counties, it's going to be very difficult to get them to go along, and it's. On top of that, it's not just strictly a political question. These counties do not have the money or the tax base to pay for these things. And so in the end, like even if you could find a sympathetic leader in Worcester County or Dorchester County or Allegheny County who was like, yeah, you know what, let's do that, they still at the end of the day have to go home and look at their checkbook and realize that like the check, the bank account doesn't pay for the ambition, and they have to figure something out.
If there is no pathway there, and he is not able to provide a plan that is acceptable, across the state, then he is going to continue to get pushback. It's not an easy path right now for Governor Moore.
It's not. But look, I mean, in the past, when the state has needed revenue and has decided to pass a tax increase, whether that was, for example, the 1 cent increase on the sales tax, or when the state decided to make some other policy decision like increasing increasing the minimum wage, for example, which is an increase that really affected large and small counties almost equally. In the end, like if there is the will to do it in the majority caucus, then it's going to happen. They know where their votes are. And so, like if it has to be done, it probably will get done, and there'll still be that pushback. And then the question becomes, what's the ramifications for that? In 2014, we saw Larry Hogan run a very effective campaign on the O'Malley administration looking at tax and fee increases. A Republican like Larry Hogan could do that again. The question is there another Republican out there like Larry Hogan in Maryland?
Well, that's a big question. And maybe we'll find out if Larry Hogan of 2017 is Larry Hogan of 2024 very, very soon. On Saturday morning, before the governor's speech, listening to the county leaders, I got the impression, even from the Republican ones, that they expected this glide path that you had mentioned earlier, that they expected some kind of relaxing of the blueprint deadlines, of the blueprint demands, in light of the fact that the governor seems not ready yet to raise taxes in order to fund the blueprint.
No, I think your observation is correct. That was exactly what I heard in that room, and it's what I have heard in that room or rooms like it over the past year and a half or so. I mean, there is a realization, and has been for a number of years, from the local governments, that this was going to be a really tough thing to do for them. Steve Hershey, who was in that room, the Senate Minority Leader from the Eastern Shore, from the upper Eastern Shore, and a Republican, said to me at one point, he believes that a glide path is possible. He said, because the state is finally coming to the realization that they are also going to have challenges paying for it, which is something that he said, the local jurisdictions have been saying very vocally for the last 4 or 5 years. And so I think that there's sort of this building consensus that something's going to have to be done. Again, I'm not sure what that looks like. In my conversations, I'll go back to Mako, where I talked to Vanessa Atterbury, the chair of House Ways and Means. And she said that she would be willing to have discussions about making cuts to the blueprint or extending the time that we implement it. But she wants to see data, and she's like, if you can show me data that something's not working, or show me some other kind of data, she's like, I'd be willing to have those discussions. And so she has sort of drawn that line that, like, if you want to do these things, you're going to have to make a very strong data-driven argument to her to do something like that. And so I think that's going to be, again, I think that's going to be a really interesting conversation that gets had when we head, in the months leading up to Annapolis, and when we return for session at the beginning of January.
What do you think is really the best hope here?
We're in this situation where they're probably this year and likely next, because politically nobody likes to raise taxes in the fourth year of the term as you're headed into an election year. I think they're going to try to find ways to live within their means. There'll continue to be discussions about revenue enhancements, because there are some in the House that want to continue to have those discussions. I think all of this gets pushed. A lot of it gets pushed beyond the election, and with the idea, I think that Ferguson and the governor are both really hoping that the state economy will really start to turn around. You heard in the governor's speech that he believes that they're showing some signs of that turning around, and that and that the state economy will pick up and revenues will rise naturally, and that will soften any need to then go back to taxpayers and ask for more money.
Okay, so this is a hope that the economy picks back up, and then the pie grows and nobody has to give up anything, right?
Yeah, I mean, here's the concern, Sunil. I think you've got one of the things that you have to worry about is Maryland is a company town. And by that, I mean, we have a large number of federal employees in Maryland, a large number, a lot of the budget rests on, federal contracting, federal agencies in Maryland. I mean, one of the largest employers, as you well know, is Fort Meade. A lot rides on this election. I mean, I think if Donald Trump is elected, I think there's a lot of concern, especially in Maryland, about what that might mean for the budget and for federal government, the size of federal government and federal contracting. There is always this looming prospect of a budget battle that results in, a budget-driven federal government shutdown. I was here for the last one. It was painful to the state's finances initially. I think all of that, is also in play. And
you just said sales tax is down, right?
And yes, well, I want to be clear. I don't know that sales tax is down. There is a concern that sales taxes are going to come back lower than expected in September, but we haven't seen any numbers. September will really be our gateway into that. But Senate President Bill Ferguson suggested that was an area of concern for him. He believes that anecdotally, sales are down, that people are spending less. Look, I mean, we'll know in September. The other thing I'd like to add to this discussion, though, about Maryland being a company town is that while we are so dependent on the federal government, and Wes Moore is talking about diversifying Maryland's economy and building it out, he's also lauding the fact that we are bringing the FBI headquarters to Greenbelt, which is essentially doubling down on the company town mentality. And again, if Donald Trump is elected, one has to ask the question, would he find a way to nix that coming to Maryland before a shovel gets in the dirt, and send that to Virginia, where the leader of that state is perhaps a little more friendly to Donald Trump than here in Maryland?
Well, I think first things first for Governor Moore, get Kamala Harris, and I think Angela also works elected, right?
I mean, look, we are less than 80 days to the general election, and so that is the task before Democrats, and similarly, Republicans in Maryland are working to try and get Larry Hogan elected. It'll be very interesting to see how all of that again. Election, going back to what I said earlier, the 2024 election will be a key component to all of this.
Right. And 2 months after that, he has to turn in his budget.
Yeah, it all starts happening very fast. It sounds like we have a long time, but I will tell you, in reality, we do not.
Bryan Sears, thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
That's Bryan Sears, veteran statehouse reporter for Maryland Matters. That's all for this episode of I Hate Politics, where we aim to stem the decline in local news by working with community voices. Don't forget to tune in to our Tuesday morning news analyses. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta, and assistant producer, Adama Gay, with support from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I direct UMBC's political science program at the universities at Shady Grove in Montgomery County, where, among other things, we explore and learn about politics, government, and society close to home. Music for this episode comes from Alexandria, Virginia alt-rock band, Jackie and the Treehorns, Steve Rubin and Pam Long on vocals, guitars, and piano, Frank Caputo on bass and synth, and Brian Gibson on drums. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihbpod.org. I hope you will subscribe, share, and rate the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.
Give it some time and I'll be front page news. I tell you what, I've got nothing more to lose. I might be too much for you to explain. My own persistence as immortal remains.